Reading is from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. The Tower of Babel. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar was used for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves, with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," he said, "the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other." In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Dropping things all over the place here. Okay. So, as we said, we're sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel here with the two Johns away. So, put up with me for the next few minutes as we just talk about the Tower of Babel and the passage that Sue has just read to us. The genesis of this was actually my thinking through the importance of this message was when Lorna and I went to the Great Masters about August last year. If you remember, it was at Goma. I don't know why it was at the Gallery of Modern Art, but that's where it was. And there was 80 paintings that had been on loan from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So we went up to see these, and we've actually got a couple of examples. I noticed that in the early part of the, you went through several rooms, in the early part of the tour through these rooms, from the earliest part, they were from 1420 was the earliest, through to around the 1600s, a lot of the paintings had a religious connotation. I don't know whether you can see it on this one, but there's Jesus on the cross, and the painting behind the woman in the front. There's Mary, and there's the Apostle John there. The woman actually represents the Catholic Church, and I think it's interesting that she has her foot on the globe. A lot of those paintings then from the early part of the exhibition had religious connotations. As you went through the rooms into the 1700s, 1800s, that dropped away, and a lot of the paintings were contemporary or secular. If we could have the next one. See, this one here is like from Georges Latour in about 1650. And you can see now where this is no longer a biblical story. In actual fact, this chap is negotiating with the fortune teller to have his fortune told. Then if you look closely, the woman on his right has got a pair of cutters and is cutting the chain to his watch. And the woman on the left has her hand in his pocket. So you can see there's quite a contemporary secular approach to a lot of the paintings later on in the exhibit. And this, of course, is quite understandable because before we had the printing press and before we could read a lot of the biblical messages, somebody had to explain it to people. And the paintings were an ideal way of doing that. You had a painting of a biblical story and then you could explain it. So once the printing press happened, then the things changed. People learnt to read and they learnt to write, and they were no longer dependent upon the church for a lot of their knowledge, and maybe that was a good thing. But in terms of where the Tower of Babel fits in, it illustrates what we are continually going through as a society as things progress. So some consider the story of the Tower of Babel historical. Some consider it allegorical. We're not going to get into that argument today. We're just going to look at the message. What does the message of the Tower of Babel tell us as Christians today? And more importantly, what does it mean for us as we go forward with our rejuvenation program here in Mudgeeraba Uniting? So let's have a look and see what we can learn. It's actually a picture of the Tower of Babel here. A lot of people consider it would look like this. Right? So it goes up in a circular fashion. And it's interesting to note that the people of the time had come up with this new technology to build a tower. They were going to build it with bricks and tar, not with stone. I mean, it was very difficult, number one, to get enough stone to build the tower all the way up, and number two, to haul it all the way up as you were going. It would have been a lot of work. So they had this new technology that they were going to deal with. And it struck me that the new technology is something that we need to make sure we consider going forward. So I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent for a minute and talk about what that means. So point one in this sermon, I've got 3 points. A lot of good sermons have 3 points. The corollary is not true, but let's go with 3 and see what that does for us. Point 1. Mankind elevates itself in an act of conceit. Okay? In fact, there's a very good song, if you don't know it, by Bob Dylan called Disease of Conceit. It's worthwhile. If you can stream it, listen to it. These people wanted to make a name for themselves. In verse 4 they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we might make a name for ourselves." That was the intent, their intent. And this is sort of happened throughout history. So we were talking about the printing press. So when the printing press happened, that provided a far greater communication mechanism for people, didn't it? People communicate with each other so much better when people can read or write. The railway, that was another big change in society when the railway hit, because that removed the tyranny of distance. In actual fact, I still remember going to Euston Station in London and seeing one of the last steam engines leave the station. My brother was a bit of a train nut, my older brother, and he took my younger brother and myself to Euston Station to see one of the last steam engines leave it. It was dramatic, really dramatic. There was a puff of steam, and ever so slowly this huge wheel that was as big as me started to turn faster. In fact, I had electric trains, steam engine as an electric train. I don't know whether anybody else was into electric trains, but I was. I still have it, actually. And it's called, the steam engine's called the Golden Fleece. And I asked my dad, why is it called the Golden Fleece? And he said, I don't know. We'll have to go to the library and look up the encyclopedia. But we never did. It was probably about 30 years later, I Googled it. 15 nanoseconds, I knew what Golden Fleece was. There was 4 trains, actually, that used to run from northern England, pulling the wool down to London for sale, and then for international sales. And Golden Fleece was one of those engines. I digress. Then there was TV. TV has been a major dislocation for society. It has ruined community. Before TV, we used to have community events that people would come to, but no longer. It's too easy to veg in front of the TV, isn't it? Rather than engage in relationships. Internet, we've mentioned the internet. Major changes to us in terms of society and what it does. I heard someone say the other day that information is doubling every day because of the internet. That's not true, of course. information's going up, drivel is doubling every day. We really do have to be conscious of what the internet is doing for us, and it does provide an outlet for instant recognition, doesn't it? If you want a self-aggrandizement, you can do your TikTok dance, or you can go onto Twitter and say silly things. But it's important for us as Christians to think, what does that mean to us? We need to start thinking why. Why do we use technology, and what's it used for, and how then do we make best use of it in our mission, which of course is go into all the world and preach the gospel. We need to read and write the books that give us the good news, give us the capability of communicating the good news. We need to get on the train when it makes a lot of sense, not to get on the train so that we go away for the weekend and miss Sunday morning service. We need to watch TV for relaxation and turn it off when we go to Bible study. We need to use the internet for communication and education as well, and actively counter fake news and other atrocities that are happening about it. James Webb Telescope, you know, the telescope that's just been put and commissioned. It's all unfurled now, and they're in a commissioning phase that's probably going to take about 6 months. 2 news stories I heard were quite ludicrous. They said that it would allow us to look back to the time of the Big Bang. So there's 2 problems with that. Number 1, Big Bang was a hypothesis. And number 2, to actually do that it's sort of self-aggrandizement, isn't it? We don't need God. We don't need God the Creator. We had a Big Bang, and we can explain it all now. That's the thoughts behind a lot of what's happening. So I went onto the NASA site and looked up about the James Webb. There's nothing to do with going back and seeing the Big Bang. In fact, I'll read to you one of the descriptions they had there. It says, by viewing the universe at infrared wavelengths, Webb will show us things never before seen by any other telescope. It is only at infrared wavelengths that we can see the first stars and galaxy forming after the Big Bang. The journalists had translated that, and we were going to see the Big Bang. I do have a problem with that, even that though, because it doesn't really explain well and doesn't put it into context for us, does it? I'm going to, if you like this, I'll send it to NASA and see if they'll put it up on the website. The mission is to test the hypothesis that God created the universe with a cataclysmic event, following which matter began to congeal and form stars and galaxies that we now know. Wouldn't that be good? Do you think they'll put that up? They could go on and say, we'll do this by extending our observation to the infrared electromagnetic spectrum that will indicate the formation of stars before they compress sufficiently to the state of generating visible light. If this is observed, it will support the hypothesis that God's creation of the universe commenced with the Big Bang event. Okay? If you like it, I'll send it, but I'm not sure they'll put it up. It sort of reminds me, you know, this when we see these acts of, well, we know best and we know this, of what Paul wrote in Romans 1:21. Although they knew God, let's face it, we all have a spiritual life because we're made in the image of God. They neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles. Paul's referring to his generation where the worship of inanimate objects became popular, and it became to divert mankind from their spiritual heritage. Let's face it, today most people deny their spiritual self. I mean, we in our community, we have great neighbours. They're lovely people, but they think we're bonkers going to church on Sunday morning. So that's the situation we're in, and that's what we've got to think through in terms of the rejuvenation program. Point 2, mankind does not do what God instructs. Okay. Back in Genesis 9, this is before that passage in Genesis 11 that we read, it says, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Remember, after the flood, God instructed people to increase in number and fill the earth. But if you read the passage about the Tower of Babel, they didn't do that. It says, let's make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Isn't that what we do? We don't do what God instructs. We want to go our own way, doing our own thing. It was not what they were instructed to do. The people building the tower, they wanted to collaborate together. It gave them a sense of belonging. They become more knowledgeable. It was easier staying in the city than going into the country. So they said, that's what we're going to do. And they missed out on life more abundant. Of course, there's nothing wrong with planning and studying for a career and working your way up the corporate ladder. But when it's contrary to God's will for your life, then it's problematic. Easy for you to say, I hear you say. You're retired, so. But I think it's even more important for us who are retired, because being retired, it gives us the ability to do other things. And if we get focused on, the superannuation and moving into another place, and if that becomes our focus, then we're missing out potentially on what God is asking us to do. If we fail to have the confidence to walk through the doors that open up to us in life, that's a problem. If we're so fixated on following a path that we've planned out for us, then we're not only going to forsake the life more abundant that God has promised us, but we're likely to see our plans don't work out. And that brings us to the third point that we can learn from this particular passage. Mankind's attempts to go their own way will be frustrated. God's will be done. Even the story of Jonah is the epitome of that, isn't it? Jonah was told, go to Nineveh and preach to the people in Nineveh about repentance. What did he do? He got on a boat going the other way. Big storm, got thrown overboard, fish eats him, regurgitates him on the beach. God says, how about we go to Nineveh? And he did go to Nineveh, and it was wildly successful. They did repent and turn from what they had been doing. In the end, God's will prevail. The Bible tells us that. But in the bigger picture, if we look at history, most of what's happened, what was prophesied in the Bible to happen, has happened. Right? The salvation of the Jews from Egypt. Right? That was foretold. It was going to be 400 years. It was actually 420 years. But Moses brought them out of Egypt. The exile to Babylon in 597. The return under Nehemiah 70 years later. Jeremiah got the prophecy that it was going to be 70 years. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. The restoration of Israel in 1948. It's all happened. Let's look forward to what we know as Christians is going to happen, shall we? I love Revelation. Revelation 21 says this, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. The sea denoting the Gentiles, non-Jews. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, i.e. the church, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Now, remember in Daniel, he was told, "Don't write this down." Well, John in Revelation is told, "Write it down." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Omega, Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To him who is thirsty I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." I'm banking on that happening, by the way. I hope we all are. In conclusion, then, let's just look at how these 3 points are going to affect what we now need to do as for the rejuvenation program. Because as we seek out to reach the community, there's close to 10,000 cars a day going past our property. Each with a person in it that has a spiritual need. So the first thing is we must not be motivated by self-aggrandizement. Okay? Let's cut the conceit out of this. Let's focus on what God wants us to do. It's not a matter of increasing the number of bums on seats here on a Sunday morning. Okay? That's, unfortunately, people these days don't want to sit in a row singing hymns. I love it, but most people don't. Okay? If you've got kids in nippers, you should be at the beach. Not today. Not today because there's a tsunami coming. But normally on Sunday morning you should be at the beach, right? So we need to, as a church, accommodate what that means. There's other things that we tend to do as well, like the food baskets come to mind. Okay? There was 40 food baskets done by Mudgeeraba Uniting Church for people at Christmas time in the community that's hurting. Right? New Life did 500. So we can say, "Oh, why we only did 40 ones? Well, they did 500. Or we can say, "Isn't that great? There's 40 people in the community that had a good Christmas because of Mudgeeraba Uniting." Okay, so let's not worry about comparing ourselves with others or what's happening. Second point is we're to stay true to God. The whole point of our community outreach is to reach the community for Christ. Okay. And we won't do this by heading off on our own programs or doing programs for the sake of doing programs. We've got to keep the why in mind, the mission that we want. We've got to translate the great things that are happening in the op shop to reaching people for Christ. We've got to take the playgroup. The playgroup is a wonderful opening to small families. We need to maybe work on the Grandies program. We need to make sure that we're cementing those people into the church activity here. The last item is to be sensitive to God's leading. Okay? And this is where we must collectively look to see and discern God's will for us. What is it that we should be doing? We need to restart the prayer program that we had going. We need to seek diligently what the Spirit is going to do within the community here through us. Okay? So I think the message of the Tower of Babel is, let's make sure that we do things for that it's in God's will and is through our discernment of what His will is for us that are furthering the mission of this church here in the community of Mudgeeraba, and make sure that we do stay sensitive to His leading.